Is Baby Driver on cruise control? Let's find out. Hello Fanatics, I'm Dylan Phillips, and this is the Film Fanatic Review bringing you Baby Driver, starring Ansel, Elgort, Lily James, and Kevin Spacey. First, we'll tell you what the movie is about, and our initial thoughts. Then we'll move on to some spoiler-free likes and dislikes. We'll finish up with our spoiler-heavy thoughts on this film, and our final word. Baby Driver follows the story of a young getaway driver who is coerced into working for a crime boss and finds himself part of a doomed heist. I'll preface this by saying that Edgar Wright is one of my favorite writer-directors working today, and that he's one of the reasons that I decided to pursue a career in film. Overall, this film is a fun, engaging, and entertaining popcorn flick. It's basically the Grand Theft Auto movie that we didn't know we wanted. However, at the same time, it does fall victim to too much hype. For what I liked about this film, I'll say that this is one of the most original films that we've seen in recent years. That isn't to say that this story isn't one that we haven't seen before, but the mix of Edgar Wright's visual storytelling and the slight addition of unique plot devices definitely makes this more original than the movies we see today. One of the most original parts of this film is that the protagonist Baby, played by Ansel Elgort, has tinnitus thanks to a childhood accident, which means that he has a humming in his ears. And so to drown this out, he decides to listen to music all the time, and this becomes the heartbeat of the film. Speaking of the Edgar Wright visuals, this film is a technical filmmaker's dream. The cinematography, choreography, car chases, and action sequences are all very stylized and visual aspects of the film that make this film so unique. And every single scene, every single shot has its own story to tell, and that's very Edgar Wright. The film is filled with great characters and dialogue, giving us very flawed and real people. Meanwhile, the cast is great at portraying these characters, with some great on-screen chemistry with Elgort and James, as well as Elgort and Spacey. And the standout performances in this film to me were Elgort, Spacey, Jamie Foxx, and John Hamm. And finally, I loved the ending of this film. It tied up everything beautifully and gave us a very satisfying ending. However, as much as the soundtrack is the heartbeat of this film, it was definitely overhyped, and I'll explain this more in the spoiler section. I also found that the story dragged a bit after the opening sequence, and I understand that you're supposed to be setting up the different characters in the scenario, but it just kind of slowed down after having that incredible car chase. And I certainly found that there wasn't as much comedy in this film as there has been in other Edgar Wright movies. And that's not much of a criticism, it's more just an observation. But to me, the biggest problem in this film was definitely the female characters. Don't get me wrong, Edgar Wright writes great characters. I just found that all of the females in this film were more plot devices or romantic subplots rather than fully developed and flawed characters. And I'll explain this as well in the spoiler section. And that's where I'll end our spoiler-free thoughts on this film. If you want to hear our final word or rating of this film, pause now and click the link in the description, because now it's time for spoilers. First off, the opening scene was great. It sets the tone for the movie, giving us that slight comedy and big action car chases, and I really wish that it didn't slow down as much right after. Although there wasn't much comedy in this film, I definitely have to point out the Mike Myers mask scene. That one definitely had me chuckling. One thing I didn't expect in this film was definitely the brutal death scenes. From Fox being impaled, to Spacey being hit by a car and then his head being squished, to Hamm falling onto a car and then it exploding. And yet, all these scenes were so awesome. Speaking of Hamm, I think his character Buddy stole the show. He is the biggest character arc and the most development aside from Baby, and I really think that John Hamm portrayed this character very well, and gave us a very emotional, flawed, and tragic character. Speaking of characters, I have to go back and complain a little bit about the female characters in this movie. So the two prominent ones are Darling and Deborah, and yet both of them feel like they're not their own fully formed characters, but just subsections of Buddy and Baby. So first we have Darling, who is basically the Bonnie to Buddy's Clyde, and yet she doesn't really have any development throughout the movie. We get to hear a little bit about Buddy's past and who he was and this flawed human and where he is today, but Darling's kind of just there for the ride, and she's really his driving force throughout the movie. Meanwhile, we have Deborah, who does explain a little bit that she has lost everything. She doesn't have her parents anymore. She feels like there's nothing there driving her, and yet she decides to drop everything for this guy that she just met because he decides that he wants to give up everything and take her away. And so I don't see that as being enough development between the two characters, as well as her underlying persona, to not make it seem forced in a way for her to just kind of agree and be a forced plot point to kind of be his reason to get out of the business. But maybe that's just me. The other part that I had an issue with was the overhyped soundtrack. Now, don't get me wrong, the soundtrack is really good. And if you look at it in comparison to the film that came out earlier this year, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, the songs are definitely not as well known. That didn't take me out of the movie that much because, Edgar Wright picked great songs, and they're songs that you can listen to. But I think that going beyond that, the way that the soundtrack is supposed to work in this movie is that because of his tinnitus, it's supposed to kind of elicit the emotions that Baby's feeling. And so he uses songs to pump him up for car chases, but he also listens to songs when he has other emotions. And I feel like some of these songs didn't really convey that. It was supposed to be the heartbeat of the movie, and at some points it just felt kind of there. And I feel like people overhyped that and made it sound like the soundtrack was great for listening everywhere when it's eliciting specific emotions. Same with the whole relationship between him and Deborah. The songs that he listens to, just because they have her name in them, is that his way of conveying that he's falling for her because he falls for the songs as well? Maybe, but I feel like other songs that might have had deeper meaning in the lyrics, aside from just having her name in them, might have been able to elicit that emotion a little bit more. And that's why I have a problem with this soundtrack, because as much as it is a great collection of songs, and it's songs that I definitely would enjoy listening to, I just think that as I've been hearing from more and more people, they were saying it as if this soundtrack was the best soundtrack in any movie ever, and yet I didn't feel that way. Now, does that mean that I think the Guardians soundtrack is better than this one because the songs are #1 hits? No. I just think that the songs in this movie didn't portray the tone that needed to be there in each scene. And some of my favorite scenes were the opening car chase where Baby takes the spike strip and whips it back into the police car's wheels and flips it over, as well as the part where he goes into the other lane and stops the other car so that it switches, kind of like when you put a ball under 3 cups. And then I also enjoyed the second car chase, particularly where he takes the pickup truck and rides along the wall. And then the final foot race / car chase scene where he's constantly mixing in with Buddy and trying to evade everyone and has to go and find Deborah. That starts with the heist where Jamie Foxx's character dies. That was a great scene, and it definitely revs up the action from then. But my favorite scene by far in this movie was definitely the warehouse gun deal, where it just felt like something out of a very intense first-person shooter. It gave me the sense of like Hardcore Henry. It gave me a sense of a recent film that just came out, Free Fire, and Reservoir Dogs. And I really liked the high-intensity action in that scene, and I really wished that there could have been 1 or 2 more scenes in this movie like that. So, with the thoughts heard, here's our final word. Baby Driver is a fun, entertaining car chase movie that is not short on thrills. Although its soundtrack is a bit overhyped, its original story, supported by fantastic characters, dialogue, action, and stylized visuals, shows that Edgar Wright has yet to put his creativity on cruise control. This film is the reason that we didn't get an Edgar Wright-helmed Ant-Man, and for good reason, because this movie is a hell of a ride. So I'm going to give Baby Driver an 8.5. Thanks everybody for watching our review. Are you planning on seeing Baby Driver, or if you've already seen it, do you have something to add? What did you think of the story? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Dylan Phillips, and this has been the Film Fanatic Review. If you liked this video and you want to see more, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Check out our latest Fanatic 5 video where we discuss the top Mark Wahlberg roles. Don't forget to follow us on our social media. And until next time, Fanatics, keep it real.